of course, reiterate my call for hostages to be released unconditionally. And that, I think, is the important word. It's unconditional. And the recognition of the Palestinian state also cannot be conditional. And I'm afraid neither conditional on release of hostages or nor conditional on any actions that Israel itself takes.
Historic or reckless? This morning, the UK moves to recognise a Palestinian state while Israeli hostages remain in captivity and tensions couldn't be higher. For some, it's a long overdue step toward peace. For others, it looks like rewarding Hamas at the worst possible moment. And back home, this foreign policy shock is already spilling into Britain's own culture wars. The key fault line is simple: unconditional recognition colliding with the call for unconditional release of hostages. Is this about principle, or is timing everything when lives are still on the line? Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let's roll it.
What is your reaction this morning to this move from the Starmer government? Do you welcome it?
You're right, it is an historic moment. I do welcome it, albeit 75 years overdue. I would say also it's important because a lot of people, understandably in their comments and their commentary around this issue, talk about the impact it may well have on the current genocide, as I view it certainly, and millions of others do, that's taking place in Gaza. Actually, it's a lot more long-term than that, and of course includes what I think is, again, the overdue recognition of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, both in Gaza and the West Bank. And let's be frank here, there is not a nation on earth that can really credibly talk about a two-state solution, which, by the way, has to be the pathway to peace in such a volatile area of the world. There's nobody that can credibly talk about a two-state solution without recognition of both states. So welcome, long overdue, won't stop what's happening in Gaza, but for the long term is exceptionally important.
Do you understand why so many people listening to this and listening to what you've said and who will listen to the Prime Minister this afternoon worry that this will be interpreted as a victory for Hamas and that they will claim it to be so? That is undoubtedly the case, isn't it?
Well, how people claim it is entirely up to them. But let's remember here, we're talking about 2 million people, around 2 million people in Gaza, millions of people in the West Bank who've got nothing to do with Hamas, who had nothing to do with those terrible atrocities that took place on the 7th of October 2023. They have an inalienable right to self-determination. And this is recognition, alongside, by the way, already the majority of the world who recognises the Palestinian state. And for those that are interested in peace, like me, like you, like all of your listeners, I suspect, if you want to stop the cycles of violence that we have seen over the last, again, over 75 years, then there has to be a diplomatic solution. That diplomatic solution, in my view, is a two-state solution. Some people argue that it's not a two-state solution. My argument is that it has to be a two-state solution. And the only way you can credibly advocate for a two-state solution is recognition of both sides. You can't recognise one state and one side of the equation without recognising the other.
Do you understand why many people caught up in this in one way or the other, and in particular the families of hostages who to this day are still being held in captivity in appalling conditions by Hamas, are so against this move? Indeed, they have written to the British government, the families of the hostages, today saying, "We write to you with a simple plea. Do not take this step until our loved ones are home and in our arms." What would your response to that be?
Well, first of all, you would have to have a heart of stone not to have empathy with the families of hostages. They've been waiting for almost 2 years for their loved ones to come back home. And I, of course, reiterate my call for hostages to be released unconditionally. And that, I think, is the important word. It's unconditional. And the recognition of the Palestinian state also cannot be conditional. And I'm afraid neither conditional on release of hostages or nor conditional on any actions that Israel itself takes. So those who want to see the release of hostages want to see a ceasefire. It's only going to come through diplomacy. It's why hostages' families themselves have said and urged and pleaded with Benjamin Netanyahu to do more, because he's clearly not doing enough in order to ensure there's a ceasefire. So, of course, I have empathy with the hostages' families. Who would not? But the recognition of the Palestinian state is once again the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. That's unconditional, regardless of what is happening in Gaza or out with.
But you know that all of this takes place in a deeply political context, and you know that Hamas will say that this is a victory. There are critics who say that this is therefore, in some senses, or in some sense, will be seen as rewarding Hamas for the appalling, heinous atrocities that they committed on October the 7th. Does that not give you any pause at all?
When you take a decision of this significance in this history and this important milestone, I'm pretty certain, as somebody who's often critical of the UK government, they would have given it some thought. They would have thought about the implications this way or that.
Well, some people are criticising, some people are suggesting this is about internal Labour Party politics.
No, look, I just don't accept that because, to be frank, even with recognition of the Palestinian state, the Labour Party and the UK government are complicit in what's happening in Gaza. We know there is a genocide taking place, a UN Commission report, of course, most recently making that case. And the UK government continues to sell arms to the government of Israel. So this doesn't, I'm afraid, whitewash what the UK government is doing in Gaza. And look, let me just remind you of your history, of course. Israel was founded on the back of a campaign of terror. British officials died in that campaign of terror. For example, the bombing of the King George Hotel.
And here's where the real pressure point explodes into view. We've got two claims sitting side by side that simply don't fit together. On one hand, recognition of Palestine is framed as an inalienable right, absolute, unconditional, not something to be bartered away. On the other hand, we have an equally passionate demand. The hostages must also be freed unconditionally, but if both are unconditional, what happens when those principles collide? This is the dilemma at the heart of the debate. Rights-based recognition says you don't let armed groups dictate political legitimacy. But politics doesn't live in a vacuum. It lives in signals. And in wartime, timing itself is a signal. Critics warn that moving now blurs the line between recognizing a people's right to statehood and looking like you're rewarding the very group holding innocent civilians in the dark. The guest tries to widen the lens, pointing back at Britain's arms sales, the soaring civilian toll in Gaza, and the UK's historic role in the region. His argument boils down to this. If Israel's existence was recognized and defended for 75 years, then parity demands that Palestine must also be recognized, regardless of what Hamas does today. A quick clarification. The hotel reference wasn't random. It almost certainly pointed back to the King David Hotel bombing in 1946. That's a historical analogy, not a direct comparison to today, but it shows how deep memory runs in this conflict. Meanwhile, the presenter hits back hard, saying Hamas could end this tomorrow by laying down their weapons and releasing the hostages. That counterattack shifts the spotlight back onto Hamas, testing whether recognition can ever be separated from militant veto power. Keep that tension in mind, because it sets the stage for what's coming next. The so-called Arab technocrats' plan for Gaza and the domestic political earthquake that erupted with the Tommy Robinson March. That's where foreign policy collides with Britain's own identity wars.
I don't think that the government of Israel can then use that to flip that around, to turn that around, to say that terrorism is being rewarded. When remember the recognition of the Palestinian
there are some who
state,
say, there will be people, as you know, Humza Yousaf, who will say, look, this conflict and this appalling suffering could end, and it would end if Hamas laid down their arms, they accepted that they would have no role whatsoever in any future Palestinian state, which is now recognised by the United Kingdom, and they were to release the hostages, as you say, unconditionally. That critique, I'm sure you won't agree with it, but that critique would say that ultimately what is going on and the violence that we're seeing and the suffering of the Palestinian people, about whom it is clear Hamas care not very much, is ultimately at Hamas's door.
By the way, in terms of the Arab plan, you'll remember from a few months ago, there was, of course, the announcement of the advocacy of that plan, that Palestinian technocrats, not Hamas, not Fatah, not the PLO, but Palestinian technocrats take over Gaza. And Hamas, by the way, agreed to that plan. So even from my understanding, it doesn't sound like Hamas want to be governing the Gaza Strip in the future. But let me just go back to this point. When it comes to criticism or critique or claims and counterclaims, people will say all sorts of things. I've heard for almost 2 years, people really displaying an incredible amount of mental gymnastics to be able to justify the slaughter of 18,000 children in Gaza. So there will always be people who will be able to claim and counterclaim. I suppose my point is this, very simply. If the UK government, who, as you said in your introduction to this piece, have got a historic role and historic responsibility to this particular region, if they recognise the state of Israel as they have done for 75 years plus, then it's only right, regardless of what is happening in Gaza and elsewhere, that they recognise the Palestinian state as part of a two-state solution, the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. And of course, there will be claim and counterclaim. But it is important we now have, I think, a real tide, a tidal wave, and in fact, the tide, in fact, turning against Israel, that people are recognising, and nation states are recognising what is happening to the Palestinian people is absolutely unjust, and we have to press every single lever to stop that injustice from happening any day longer.
Just turning to slightly wider matters, or rather, in a sense, narrow matters within domestic British politics. I wonder, obviously we're a week on now from that Tommy Robinson march, the Unite the Kingdom march that we saw. We saw Elon Musk address it. Obviously, Robinson is a figure, to give him his correct name, Stephen Yaxley Lennon is a figure who has long decided to focus on British Muslims. Many people would say, indeed I think it is unarguable, that he has whipped up a great deal of prejudice against British Muslims. I wonder, as a very senior British Muslim yourself, political figure, what you make of Robinson apparently coming to the centre stage of British politics, in particular speaking, it seems, increasingly on behalf of the British right. We heard Liz Truss say yesterday, or over the course of the weekend, that she believes that he's been demonised or unfairly treated. What's your reaction to all of this?
Well, I don't think anybody in the world should ever take Liz Truss seriously. There is no question to which Liz Truss, I'm afraid, is the answer. But let me take your broader question to me, if I may, and I will answer it as a Muslim, not as a former First Minister, not as an elected member, but somebody who is Muslim, who is born in this country, raised in this country, educated in this country, raising his family in this country, and has no other country that he calls home. And I cannot tell you how heartbroken I am, and I'm not using that pejoratively, I mean genuinely heartbroken, that we saw a week ago 150,000 people rally behind a convicted fraudster and thug, a man who has called Islam, and I quote, a violent and fascist ideology, and made numerous other anti-Islamic remarks. And of course, at that march, they heard from Lawrence Fox, who very famously said that we have to get rid of Islam from the UK. They heard from Katie Hopkins, who echoed Nazi propaganda by once saying there has to be, and I quote, a final solution to the problem of Muslims in the UK. And they heard from a New Zealand evangelical who said that you must ban halal, ban Islam, ban shrines, ban temples, and ban anything that is non-Christian. How does that make me feel? Heartbroken, yes. Scared, the direction that this country is going in. But also, it is a warning signal, and alarm bells should be ringing for every single one of us who absolutely value the diversity of this country, not ignoring the issues that there are out there in society, but saying that actually what makes this country great, what makes Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, Wales, the United Kingdom, a really positive force for the world, is the fact that we have this wonderful diversity. And those people that have come to this country to make it their home have always contributed far more than they take.
So where does this leave us? At the core, it's a clash between principle and leverage. Should recognition of a people's right to statehood stand firm, never dependent on the actions of armed groups? Or does timing matter more than ideals when innocent lives are literally hanging in the balance? Supporters argue this move carves out the only credible path toward a two-state solution, a foundation for diplomacy that refuses to be held hostage. But critics insist it risks handing extremists exactly what they crave, a moment to claim victory and fuel their narrative. That's the razor's edge we're walking on right now. Is this bold diplomacy or dangerous symbolism? I'll leave it to you. Principle versus leverage. What should lead when the human cost is this high? Until next time, this has been the Whipline Watch. Thanks for tuning in.